Hey Meissner makers, it's Jennifer. It is Wednesday, it's 1 o'clock, and you know what that means? A new edition of Wednesday Workshop at 1. By special request, today we're going to take a look at a project that is perfect for summer. It's perfect in terms of the colors, it's just bright, cheery, happy, but it also is an easy summer sewing project. Yes, there's some cutting, there's some piecing involved, but it's not precision piecing, and it gives you an amazing look. So the block we're going to take a look at today is the Wonky star block, and we have it here in a couple of different sizes on the piece that's on the table, and we'll hold it up after we stitch through some blocks. But what I love about this is it looks like you had to work really hard to get these stars and these points in different sizes, but it is super, super easy. No fussing around with perfection with this particular project. The other thing that I like about this particular block is that it lends itself really, really well to working with scraps. Now, I don't know about you, but in my sewing studio, I have a lot of these drawers and bins, and in my head, I'm going to get super, super organized, and I'm going to take my scraps and I'm going to pre-cut them so that I have my 5-inch, my 2.5-inch strips, my 2.5-inch squares, depending on the sizes that I typically use. And so the hint there is I go with sizes that are typically available in standard pre-cuts. That way, my scraps have become my own custom pre-cuts. So at home, in my time sitting by the pool probably this summer, I'm going to go through some of these scraps and check to see, what size do we have here? This piece would lend itself well to some 2.5-inch strips. It would lend itself well to some 5-inch squares. So I am ready to go with any of my personalized pre-cuts out of my stash versus reaching down in here and just wondering what have we got and how much do we have of it. So it's going to be a nice organization project. Now, in order to start that organization project, you can do it one of two ways. You can always use your traditional rotary cutting method with your rulers, your rotary cutter, cut your 5-inch squares, cut your 2.5-inch strips. If you have some bigger hunks of fabric, cut those 10-inch squares. That way you have them to cut down further into the 5s if your project doesn't require something as large as a 10-inch square. So that's one of my sort of summertime to-do projects where I don't have to think really hard about it, and it's going to be nice and tidy and organized when I go in and I'm ready to stitch something up quickly, like these Wonky heart blocks. Now, I am definitely one for how can I get it done a little bit more quickly. So for me, I'm going to go to my Quilt cutter. If you've not worked with the Quilts before, this is a die cutting system. You will use, or you use in conjunction with it, a die, which looks like so. There are hundreds and hundreds of different dies available. Each one is a different shape and a different size. This one happens to be my 4-inch square, and I had some smaller size scraps, so I did cut a little bit up here with my 4-inch square. Your fabric goes over the die. Now, the different colors of foam show you where the blade lives. So there's a blade that lives down here in the foam. My fabric goes on top of the die, my cutting mat on top, sandwiching everything together, and then I would run it through the cutter. And let's just do one quickly here. Oh, this is one of my favorite scraps. I'm just going to accordion fold it over. Now, in real life, run this through the iron so that your scraps are cut properly. 6 layers about is what you will want to, where you'd want to max out with your cutter. So we'll just get our scraps out of the way. Our fabric is on our mat, and I'm using the manual cutter today. I'm just going to roll this right through. There is an electric cutter as well, and you would just slide your die right up to the rollers, and then it'll go through on its own. So these are a great way to get precision cuts. Now look how much tidier that is than my bin of scraps down here at the bottom. Gives you precision cuts. Everything is exactly the same size, quick, easy to do, okay? So that may be one way that you want to tame that scrap drawer. Now, let's move on to the block itself. This is even a block that doesn't require a lot of measuring. You're going to cut everything the same size for each block. So what do I mean by that? This particular block was done with 5-inch squares. So if you have a pre-cut sitting around at home, if you've used your 5-inch square with your Quilt, or you just have a grouping of fabrics that you love and you want to cut them down to 5-inch squares using your traditional rotary cutter and ruler method. This is a 9-patch type of a block. So what does that look like? A 9-patch is 3 units across, 3 units down. So when we construct our Wonky stars, you have 3 units down, 3 units across, making up the 9-patch unit or 9-patch block. So when you are arranging your fabrics, you'll have a star fabric and you'll have a background fabric. So my star, we're going to lay one out in little patriotic colorway here, our red, white, and blue. The white is my background. I need more squares than I laid out. I need white fabrics or background fabrics. Here we go. All the way around my center. Okay, they're all the same size. Now our large block on the piece on the table, those were 5-inch squares. This one I'm using 2.5-inch squares. I had some leftover jelly roll fabrics, so they're perfect for this. Okay, center of the star, background fabric. Okay, center and the backgrounds. The points are made from another square that's cut the same size as everything else. So we have 2.5-inch squares here. We have a 2.5-inch square here. That 2.5-inch square is going to be cut on the diagonal, okay? Giving you 2 triangles cut from that square. Those 2 triangles are then positioned one at a time and stitched on your top, bottom, right, and left hand squares so that you end up with your points surrounding your star. Okay? So one more time. Every piece is cut to the same size square, whether that be a 2.5-inch square, a 3-inch square, or a 5-inch square. If you want to make great big ones, they could be 10-inch squares. The size isn't critical unless you're looking to make a particular size block, okay? So if you are looking to make a particular size block, we're going to talk about math. If you don't care and you're happy to experiment, then don't listen to this part. So 2.5-inch squares, we lose 1/2 inch in seam allowance on each segment, right? 1/4 inch, 1/4 inch, 1/4 inch, 1/4 inch, 1/4 inch, 1/4 inch, and so on. So if you have 3 squares that are 2.5 inches, that is 7.5, right? Minus, what did I say? 1/2 inch per square. So you're losing another 1/2, 1, 1.5. All right, that's going to give you the finished size of your block. You can do that, or you can just say, you know what? I have this great Quilt die for a 5-inch square. I'm cutting all my scraps into 5-inch squares. Take your star point fabrics. They are cut in the same size square as everything else. Cut them in half on the diagonal and set them aside. As you're ready to start creating the star itself, you're going to position, now I haven't shown you how to stitch this yet, so right now we're just laying everything out. You're going to stitch or lay your points out so that they look like a star point. We'll stitch it in place, then we'll lay the other point out, we'll stitch it in place, and we'll continue that for each of the 4 star point segments. Are you ready to sew one up? All right, makers, we are ready to stitch one of our little stars together. Today I'm going to be sewing on the Janome 3160 QDC. I love this machine. You know, classes are getting ready to start back up. This is very portable. It has 59 stitches to choose from. It has an automatic thread cutter. It has a needle threader. It's also nice and lightweight so that if I want to take it outside and just run that extension cord out to my back patio area, I can sit out there in the sun and enjoy an afternoon of stitching. So we're going to stitch this block together. Remember, it's based on a 9 patch, meaning 3 units across, 3 units down. Everything is cut the same size, and then we cross cut the squares for the points to create those star point areas. Now, how do we do this so that they are all a different size? So I'm going to start by positioning just one of the star points. You do need to make sure that the straight edge of the triangle is running parallel-ish to the straight edges of the square. And I'm going to position this in a way that's off-center, that just looks a little bit wonky, however it is that I think it looks good. And then I need to flip it so that I'm sewing right sides together. And I'll stitch along the diagonal of the triangle to create that first wonky star point. Now, once you've done a couple of these, you'll be able to chain stitch through and sew all of the right-hand star points, then go back and sew all of the left-hand star points. But for our purposes today and the first couple of blocks that you sew at home, I'm going to recommend that you stitch them one unit and one segment at a time, just to get a feel for how that block goes together. Okay, so we've got the first segment on. At home, I would give this just a little press. So now I'm going to flip that edge that was the star point back against the background fabric. Give it a quick press with my little travel press here. Okay, and your unit looks like so. Don't panic if you see a tiny bit of the background sticking out. That's okay, as long as it is less than 1/4 of an inch. I would say actually less than 1/8 of an inch, right? You don't want a substantial amount sticking out. Then I'm going to take the other half of that square that we cut. I'm going to lay it down on the background the way that it should be when it's finished. Flip so that I'm right sides together, like so, and then we're going to stitch again that 1/4 inch on the diagonal. So your finished square with those points will look like so. All right, it's a little bit wonky. I'm going to give it a press. And you will follow that process for each of the 4 blocks that have the points. All right, so in this example, 1, 2, 3, and 4. Once they've all been stitched, when you flip it over, this is going to be not particularly attractive. What I'm going to suggest that you do is then trim out the back area of the point fabric. So let's just do one here. And in real life, you're going to do this with your rotary cutter and ruler. In fake life, for today, we're going to trim with our scissors. What you are looking for is to return this unit to that 2.5 inch size that we started with. Okay, so it looks like so. I would recommend leaving the background fabric in here. Okay, there are some techniques like this where you are stitching a unit down to a background to hold shape, where they suggest or they direct you to cut away the background fabric. These are little tiny guys. I prefer having that background in there to keep everything nice and flat and tight. So you'll repeat that process for each of those 4 star blocks, and then you will stitch them together right across your row. So let me go ahead and stitch the remaining star points on so that you can then see what this looks like as we join each of those units together to create the finished block. And again, these instructions are exactly the same regardless of the size block that you choose to make. And you can mix up multiple sizes within one project, as you saw on our table topper piece. So if I were chain piecing these together, once I get comfortable with the construction of the block, chain piecing is nothing more than running one unit, sliding the next unit up underneath. For those of you that like to be very careful about the amount of thread that you're using, you'll really like this a lot. There's minimal starting and stopping, which means not a lot in the way of thread tails being trimmed away. And remember, you can move these up, down. The only rule is that once you return the fabric, once you turn it right sides out, that your star point fabric needs to cover the background fabric. Okay, if you are chain piecing, once you get those first 3 done, we're going to clip, give it a quick press, pressing those star points back and out of the way so that you can stitch the other side of the star point. Now you do want to use a 1/4 inch seam allowance when you're doing this. Standard quilting seam allowances apply. I would use a 60 weight thread. I really like the Meissner 60 weight cotton thread for piecing. I also like the Quilter Select 60 weight thread. Both of them are nice and fine, so they won't take up a tremendous amount of space in your seam allowance. For this project, it's a little less critical. You don't have a lot of points that are all coming together in one spot, or a lot of segments that are coming together in one spot. So there's not a lot happening with the turn of the cloth and with your thread in that case. Also make sure that you are using a fresh needle. I really like to work with a size 80 sharp when I'm piecing. Your sharp is going to have a needle point that is pointy, which sounds exactly like it is, as opposed to a universal needle, which isn't really pointed and isn't really rounded. It's fine for general sewing. It's not going to give you as precise and perfect a straight stitch as a sharp will. For piecing, one isn't, it's a matter of personal preference versus a matter of quilting rule. Okay, so our 3 little guys are stitched together here. Give them a quick press. Remember that I'm not going to trim away the background. I'm just going to trim away the excess of the star point fabric so that I still have consistent size squares. For this little red, white, and blue star, those were 2.5 inch squares. Okay, viewers at home following along, you're going to use your rotary cutter and ruler because that's going to be the quickest and the easiest. Those of you following along at home that can't remember where you put yours down, like me today, you're going to use your scissors and trim those pieces away. Now, can you just imagine sitting on a beautiful afternoon, stitching away, not having to concentrate really hard on making sure those points are matching up, and still having beautiful stars that look like you spent hours and hours. And if you did go to your scrap bin, then you can also feel very good about having been environmentally friendly. And with all that money that you saved by not buying fabric, you can zip out to pick up another notion that you have had your eye on, because you're going to feel so good. Okay, time to stitch together. Nope. Make sure the wind is not blowing while you are sitting out there by your poolside. Okay, so then our next step, once we have stitched each of the star points, is to sew the units together. So we'll sew piece A, B, and C. We'll sew A, B, and C, A, B, and C. We'll then have three separate strips, which will then join here and here. So let's do that quickly. Again, if you have multiple blocks, after you've stitched a couple of them together and you're comfortable with the process, then chain piecing, absolutely. But do get a feel for how those blocks go together first, because there is nothing quite as unfun and unsummery as having to seam rip. No one enjoys seam ripping, even when you're sitting by the pool. Now, if you do enjoy seam ripping, I have a job for you, and you can reach out to me at info@meissnersewing.com. That's INFO at meissnersewing.com. And one day, makers, we're going to have a bloopers edition of Workshop Wednesday, and it's going to be a very exciting opportunity for you to see what goes on behind the scenes. And when we get back to having classes and regular occurrences at the store, we might even have to do some filmed live in front of a studio audience editions of Workshop Wednesday. Ooh. If anybody wants to volunteer for that, shoot me an email at info@meissnersewing.com. All right, this block is almost completed. There are so many versions of this block that you can make once you get comfortable with the basic 9-unit segment, and I'll show you a couple of those in a moment. Once you're comfortable stitching this block through, you're going to say to yourself, well, what would happen if, and that what would happen if might be, what if I changed my background so they were all different colors? What if I cut some of the segments a different size? What if I cut all the star point squares a little larger than my background squares? And all of those experiments are going to lead you down a path of creating some additional quilt block options and variations that are going to be just amazing. Okay, once I have the 3 units stitched together for the top, center, and bottom of our block, I am giving those blocks or those segments a little press. I'm going to press the seams to the background, so I'm pressing the bulk away. I want this to be as flat as possible. And then we're going to join top, center, and bottom. Our block is nearly complete. Now the reason, it's twofold reason for pressing the seams the way that I did. One is to eliminate bulk at the join. The other is so that when I'm stitching these strips together, that top, middle, and bottom, where the seam allowances meet, on one strip they're going in one direction, and on the other strip they're going in the opposing direction. So they're going to nest up into each other and make a more perfect join. Now again, this is easy summertime sewing, so we aren't going to get too wrapped up about super precision. Plus, these are wonky blocks. They're not meant to be. But that's a tip for some of your projects where it is more critical to be sure that you are lining things up correctly. Because we're nesting those seams, or because I'm nesting these seams, it's not critical either, or even worth me getting out any pins to pin in place as I go. Plus, these are little tiny, this particular shape is a little tiny block. There's not that much distance, and you never ever want to stitch over pins. Okay, you can end up damaging your machine. Whoops! Also, as you're sitting by the pool, make sure that you are stitching, that you're paying attention to which direction your block goes. So I've created a variation. At home, viewers, you would need to unstitch this, and you want to join it so that it becomes star points. Don't do this at home. I know somebody right now is emailing me at info@meissnersewing.com to tell me they would be delighted to take out my seam. But I think I'm going to leave it. Because as you're creating multiple variations, I might do another one that's just random stellar occurrences throughout the top of my block. Okay, makers, let's take a look at a couple of variations to this block, including this one. All right, so a couple of intentional variations for our quilt blocks. I mentioned doing something where all of my background blocks or fabrics were different. So here I used a lot of teal scraps that I had in my bin at home to create the backgrounds. I was consistent with the floral in creating each of the star points. To me, it just felt like it needed something to be consistent. The other thing I want to draw your attention to is the center of the star. Now for these blocks, I did fussy cut my center. I had some fabric left over from a project for one of the grandchildren, and I thought it would be fun to make a pillow to go along with it. So if you are fussy cutting, I would suggest that you look for a ruler that's the size of whatever your squares are, or conversely, I happen to have this one at home. It's 3.5 inches, so I decided that I would create the star block based on the size ruler I have. There's no rule for this other than work with what you've got. If you need your squares to be a different size, your fussy cut squares, than a single ruler you may have at home, this is a great place to use a small-ish square ruler or ruler of any size that you can comfortably hold and move around. And then I would use my pink perfection tape. So maybe I want to fussy cut something that's 4.5 inches and I don't happen to have a 4.5 inch square. I will put my perfection tape on the ruler to mark off a 4.5 inch square. So now as I'm positioning it over my fabric, I can see exactly where the print or the detail in the fabric will be. I can line it up perfectly, and then I can fussy cut for the center of a block of that style. The other thing that I thought was fun was experimenting with some different size blocks. So where you're going to create a unit that joins together, this section, these 4 squares are all the same size, okay? So same formula that we used prior. But I decided I wanted something that had more length to it here. So it has to connect to the center. So this measurement has to be the same. I believe these were 3 inch. So we've got 3 inch blocks here. This portion of the rectangle has to be 3 inches because it has to join the center. So 3 inches here plus whatever length you decide on. This looks like it's about 6. That means the rest of your units have to be 3 by 6 because everything has to be able to join up together at the end. You don't have to do the math to figure these portions out. Start with 4 sections of your star and then just cut yourself another random shape. If you like the way that it looks, then continue and create the rest of the block, right? Now you have or the rest of the segment, so you have your large block. So that's everything for today. That's a quick start look at the Wonky star variation. If you were to go to Pinterest and search for Wonky stars, you are going to find so many different looks, feels, fabrics where they use darks for the backgrounds and lights for the stars. This could be the only quilt you make forever and ever and ever, and every one is going to be just a little different. So I can't wait to see what you're doing. Send us some pictures, stop by, show us your quilt projects. We'd love to hear from you. If you have questions, please reach out by way of email at info@meissnersewing.com. We'll see you next week.